At 0200 hours on June 17, 1944, Corporal James McQueen pressed his eye against the periscope of his M4A2 Sherman tank and saw what looked like a nightmare materializing out of the darkness. Metal shapes moving through the humid tropical night. Engine noise rumbling across the churned earth of the Saipan beachhead. The distinctive clatter of tank treads on coral and volcanic rock. McQueen had been in the Pacific for 18 months, fighting across Tarawa and countless smaller islands, and he had never seen anything like what was coming toward him now. Dozens of Japanese tanks, maybe more, their silhouettes visible only as darker patches against the black sky, advancing in waves toward the marine positions along the northern edge of Lake Susupe. Behind them came hundreds of infantry, their battle cries already audible above the rumble of engines. The Japanese were launching the largest armored assault in Pacific theater history, and McQueen's tank, designated Charlie 13, sat directly in their path. In the commander's cupola above McQueen, Sergeant Robert Hennessy reached for the radio handset. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost conversational. "All units, this is Charlie 13. We have multiple enemy armor inbound from the northeast. I count at least 30 contacts, maybe more. Request immediate illumination and fire support." Within minutes, star shells from American destroyers offshore would turn night into flickering daylight, and the largest tank battle of the Pacific War would begin in earnest. What nobody on either side yet understood was that this single engagement would decide not just the fate of Saipan, but the future trajectory of the entire Pacific campaign. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The island of Saipan was a volcanic outcrop in the Mariana Islands chain, roughly 1,200 miles south of Tokyo. By June 1944, it had become one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate in the Pacific Ocean. The Americans wanted Saipan for one simple reason: range. The new B-29 Superfortress bomber could not reach the Japanese home islands from existing American bases. From Saipan, however, Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya would become vulnerable to strategic bombing. The capture of Saipan would bring the war directly to the Japanese homeland. The Japanese understood this perfectly. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had declared Saipan part of the absolute national defense zone. The island garrison numbered approximately 32,000 soldiers, commanded by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. Most significantly, Saito had something that American forces had rarely encountered in the Pacific: substantial armored forces. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Goto, fielded approximately 45 tanks when the Americans invaded. Most were Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, Japan's main battle tank throughout the war. The Chiha was a product of late 1930s design philosophy, built for speed and reliability rather than protection and firepower. It weighed only 15 tons, less than half the Sherman's weight. Its crew of 4 men operated in even more cramped conditions than their American counterparts. The tank was powered by a Mitsubishi Type 97 diesel engine producing 170 horsepower, giving it a top speed of 24 miles per hour on roads. The Chiha's main armament was a Type 97 57mm gun with a relatively short barrel, limiting its muzzle velocity and penetration capabilities. At point-blank range, the best this gun could hope to achieve against a Sherman was a penetration of the thinner side or rear armor, and even that required perfect shot placement. The tank also carried 2 Type 97 7.7mm machine guns, one in the hull and one mounted coaxially with the main gun. The Chiha's armor was its greatest weakness. The frontal hull was only 25 millimeters thick and not sloped, making it vulnerable to even heavy machine gun fire at close range. Side and rear armor was just 20 millimeters. The turret front was 25 millimeters. Any hit from a Sherman's 75 millimeter gun would penetrate this armor completely, the round passing through both sides of the tank and often detonating ammunition or fuel inside. Supporting the Chiha tanks were Type 95 Hago light tanks, even less capable vehicles. The Hago weighed only 7.5 tons and was armed with a 37mm gun that was ineffective against any armored target. These tanks had been designed for reconnaissance and infantry support in Manchuria, where they faced no serious armored opposition. Against American Shermans, they were essentially death traps for their three-man crews. Both types of Japanese tanks suffered from another critical disadvantage. Their radios were unreliable when they worked at all. Japanese tank units relied heavily on visual signals, flags and lights, to coordinate movement. In daylight, this was difficult. At night or in heavy vegetation, it was nearly impossible. Sherman tanks, by contrast, had multiple radio sets. The SCR-508 radio provided communication between tanks in a platoon. The SCR-528 allowed communication with higher headquarters and supporting units. This radio advantage allowed American tank formations to coordinate their actions, concentrate fire on dangerous targets, and adapt quickly to changing situations. But Colonel Goto was planning something different. A surprise night assault, delivered with maximum speed and violence, designed to overwhelm American positions before the defenders could react. If his tanks could smash through the Marine beachhead at night and destroy the vulnerable supply dumps, they might cripple the entire American invasion. The American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. The invasion fleet was enormous. Over 500 ships carrying more than 70,000 troops. Supporting them were tank battalions equipped with the M4A2 Sherman, the diesel-powered variant preferred by the Marines. Each battalion fielded 46 Shermans, organized into 3 companies. The Sherman weighed approximately 33 tons when combat loaded. Its General Motors diesel engine, a twin General Motors 6046 diesel producing 410 horsepower, gave the tank a top speed of nearly 30 miles per hour on roads, though actual speed in combat conditions was often much less. The Marines specifically requested the diesel variant because the Navy's supply system was built around diesel fuel for ships. Getting gasoline to remote Pacific islands was logistically complicated. Diesel simplified everything. The tank carried a crew of 5 men working in cramped conditions. The commander sat in the turret cupola with a 360-degree view through periscopes. The gunner sat below and to the left of the commander, operating the main gun and coaxial machine gun. The loader worked on the right side of the turret, a physically demanding job requiring him to lift 75mm shells weighing nearly 15 pounds each and load them into the breech as quickly as possible during combat. In the hull sat the driver and assistant driver, the latter also serving as bow gunner operating a 30 caliber Browning machine gun. The main armament was a 75mm M3 gun, an American adaptation of a French design from the First World War that had been substantially improved. The gun fired several types of ammunition: armor-piercing rounds for engaging enemy tanks, high-explosive rounds for destroying bunkers and fortifications, white phosphorus rounds for marking targets or creating smoke screens. The armor-piercing M61 round could penetrate 77mm of armor at 500 yards, more than adequate against any Japanese tank. The high-explosive M48 round contained 1.47 pounds of explosive filler and was devastating against infantry in the open or troops in buildings. Against Japanese tanks with only 25mm of frontal protection and even less on the sides and rear, the Sherman's gun was absolutely lethal. The tank's armor ranged from 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 47 degrees to increase effective thickness, to 38mm on the vertical sides and rear. The turret front was 76mm thick. This was adequate protection against Japanese anti-tank weapons. The standard Japanese Type 147mm anti-tank gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor only at very close range and only if striking at a perpendicular angle. Most hits at combat ranges simply bounced off. The Sherman also mounted 2 Browning machine guns, a 50 caliber M2 on a flexible mount on the turret roof, and a 30 caliber M1919 in the bow. The 50 caliber was particularly effective, with an effective range of over 1,000 yards against infantry and the ability to penetrate light armor. In Pacific combat, these machine guns proved as valuable as the main gun for suppressing enemy infantry. When the Marines landed on June 15th, the first waves hit the beaches at 0840 hours. Naval bombardment had been pounding Japanese positions since dawn, but it was not enough. The Japanese had dug deep. As landing craft approached, Japanese artillery erupted from the hills. The beach was supposed to be secured quickly, but the Marines found themselves pinned down under withering fire. The tank companies began landing in the early afternoon. The Shermans rolled off landing ships directly onto the beach, their crews buttoned up inside. Some tanks bogged down in soft sand. Others hit unmarked shell craters and through tracks. Several tanks were hit by Japanese artillery fire as they came ashore. One Sherman from Company B took a direct hit that penetrated the side armor and killed 3 crew members. But most of the Shermans made it inland, linking up with Marine infantry and beginning the systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions. The tank infantry team that had been perfected through previous campaigns proved its worth. Infantry would identify enemy bunkers and machine gun nests. The tanks would approach and blast the positions with 75mm high explosive shells at point-blank range. Japanese positions that could have held out for days against infantry alone fell in minutes once tanks arrived. By evening, the Marines had established a beachhead approximately 3 miles wide. Supplies were coming ashore. Artillery was being positioned. Tank battalions had most of their vehicles operational. What the Marines did not know was that Colonel Goto was preparing to destroy everything they had gained. Japanese tank doctrine was fundamentally different from American approaches. Japanese tanks were designed for infantry support in China, not tank versus tank combat. They were lightly armored to keep weight down. Their guns were adequate against bunkers but inadequate against modern tanks. This had worked in China. It was disastrous against the Americans. Japanese tankers knew their vehicles were outmatched. At Tarawa, the handful of Japanese tanks that survived bombardment were destroyed instantly when they engaged Marine Shermans. But Goto believed he could overcome these disadvantages through surprise and audacity. His plan was simple. Wait until after dark. Assemble the entire regiment in the hills northeast of the beachhead. Then charge at maximum speed, smash through American lines, and wreak havoc in the rear areas. Speed and darkness would be his armor. The American invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944. The invasion fleet was enormous. Over 500 ships carrying more than 70,000 troops. Supporting them were tank battalions equipped with the M4A2 Sherman, the diesel-powered variant preferred by the Marines. Each battalion fielded 46 Shermans, organized into 3 companies. The Sherman weighed approximately 33 tons when combat loaded. Its General Motors diesel engine, a twin General Motors 6046 diesel producing 410 horsepower, gave the tank a top speed of nearly 30 miles per hour on roads, though actual speed in combat conditions was often much less. The Marines specifically requested the diesel variant because the Navy's supply system was built around diesel fuel for ships. Getting gasoline to remote Pacific islands was logistically complicated. Diesel simplified everything. The tank carried a crew of 5 men working in cramped conditions. The commander sat in the turret cupola with a 360-degree view through periscopes. The gunner sat below and to the left of the commander, operating the main gun and coaxial machine gun. The loader worked on the right side of the turret, a physically demanding job requiring him to lift 75mm shells weighing nearly 15 pounds each and load them into the breech as quickly as possible during combat. In the hull sat the driver and assistant driver, the latter also serving as bow gunner operating a 30 caliber Browning machine gun. The main armament was a 75mm M3 gun, an American adaptation of a French design from the First World War that had been substantially improved. The gun fired several types of ammunition. Armor-piercing rounds for engaging enemy tanks. High-explosive rounds for destroying bunkers and fortifications. White phosphorus rounds for marking targets or creating smoke screens. The armor-piercing M61 round could penetrate 77mm of armor at 500 yards, more than adequate against any Japanese tank. The high-explosive M48 round contained 1.47 pounds of explosive filler and was devastating against infantry in the open or troops in buildings. Against Japanese tanks with only 25mm of frontal protection and even less on the sides and rear, the Sherman's gun was absolutely lethal. The tank's armor ranged from 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 47 degrees to increase effective thickness, to 38mm on the vertical sides and rear. The turret front was 76mm thick. This was adequate protection against Japanese anti-tank weapons. The standard Japanese Type 147mm anti-tank gun could penetrate Sherman frontal armor only at very close range and only if striking at a perpendicular angle. Most hits at combat ranges simply bounced off. The Sherman also mounted 2 Browning machine guns. A 50 caliber M2 on a flexible mount on the turret roof, and a 30 caliber M1919 in the bow. The 50 caliber was particularly effective, with an effective range of over 1,000 yards against infantry and the ability to penetrate light armor. In Pacific combat, these machine guns proved as valuable as the main gun for suppressing enemy infantry. When the Marines landed on June 15th, the first waves hit the beaches at 0840 hours. Naval bombardment had been pounding Japanese positions since dawn, but it was not enough. The Japanese had dug deep. As landing craft approached, Japanese artillery erupted from the hills. The beach was supposed to be secured quickly, but the Marines found themselves pinned down under withering fire. The tank companies began landing in the early afternoon. The Shermans rolled off landing ships directly onto the beach, their crews buttoned up inside. Some tanks bogged down in soft sand. Others hit unmarked shell craters and through tracks. Several tanks were hit by Japanese artillery fire as they came ashore. One Sherman from Company B took a direct hit that penetrated the side armor and killed 3 crew members. But most of the Shermans made it inland, linking up with Marine infantry and beginning the systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions. The tank infantry team that had been perfected through previous campaigns proved its worth. Infantry would identify enemy bunkers and machine gun nests. The tanks would approach and blast the positions with 75mm high explosive shells at point-blank range. Japanese positions that could have held out for days against infantry alone fell in minutes once tanks arrived. By evening, the Marines had established a beachhead approximately 3 miles wide. Supplies were coming ashore. Artillery was being positioned. Tank battalions had most of their vehicles operational. What the Marines did not know was that Colonel Goto was preparing to destroy everything they had gained. Japanese tank doctrine was fundamentally different from American approaches. Japanese tanks were designed for infantry support in China, not tank versus tank combat. They were lightly armored to keep weight down. Their guns were adequate against bunkers but inadequate against modern tanks. This had worked in China. It was disastrous against the Americans. Japanese tankers knew their vehicles were outmatched. At Tarawa, the handful of Japanese tanks that survived bombardment were destroyed instantly when they engaged Marine Shermans. But Goto believed he could overcome these disadvantages through surprise and audacity. His plan was simple. Wait until after dark. Assemble the entire regiment in the hills northeast of the beachhead. Then charge at maximum speed, smash through American lines, and wreak havoc in the rear areas. Speed and darkness would be his armor. As dawn broke, Marines advanced to assess the damage. Burned-out tank hulls still smoked. Bodies everywhere. Equipment scattered across volcanic rock. Captain Edward Bale walked among the wrecks, counting destroyed vehicles. 31 Type 97 and Type 95 tanks were confirmed destroyed in the immediate battle area. Several more had been knocked out during pursuit. Different American units claimed credit for different kills. In the chaos of night combat, it was impossible to determine who made the killing shot. Ultimately, it did not matter. The Japanese 9th Tank Regiment had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle demonstrated what American commanders already suspected. Japanese armor was no match for American tanks. The Chiha and Hago tanks that had been adequate in China were hopelessly outclassed in the Pacific. The Sherman, criticized in Europe for its vulnerabilities against German Tigers and Panthers, was absolutely dominant against Japanese armor. This knowledge changed tank operations in the Pacific. After Saipan, Japanese commanders abandoned offensive armor use. Remaining tanks would be dug in as fixed fortifications. This was a tacit admission that Japan had lost the armor war. For Marines on Saipan, the tank battle was just the beginning of a month-long campaign. The fighting that followed was brutal. Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions. Caves and bunkers had to be cleared one by one. But the outcome was never in doubt. Sherman tanks became assault guns, driving to bunkers and firing point-blank into firing slits. Flamethrower tanks burned out cave positions. Tank dozers sealed cave entrances with defenders inside. The systematic destruction continued day after day. The psychological impact of the failed tank assault rippled through the Japanese garrison. Soldiers understood that American tanks were essentially invulnerable to their weapons. This knowledge bred fatalism that showed in increasing suicide tactics. Magnetic mines, satchel charges, suicide attacks with explosives strapped to bodies became common. The tactics occasionally disabled individual tanks but could not change the strategic balance. General Saito understood the island was lost. By late June, his forces were compressed into northern Saipan, backed against cliffs. Food was running out. Ammunition was dwindling. Medical supplies were gone. On July 5th, Saito received authorization from Tokyo for a final banzai charge. Every soldier capable of walking would participate. They would attack at dawn on July 7th, reaching the beaches if possible, dying gloriously if not. Saito drafted final orders, distributed them to surviving commanders, then committed suicide by ritual disembowelment. Command passed to Admiral Nagumo, who organized the banzai charge and prepared to die. At dawn on July 7th, approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged American lines in the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War. They came screaming, firing whatever weapons they possessed. The Americans met them with machine guns, rifles, artillery, and Sherman tanks. The slaughter was immense. The charge swept over several positions but could not be sustained. Artillery shattered attacking formations. Machine guns cut down entire platoons. By mid-morning, the charge was stopped. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Admiral Nagumo had shot himself the previous day rather than face defeat. The man who commanded the Pearl Harbor attack ended his life in a cave on a volcanic island. The campaign was declared over on July 9, 1944. More than 3,000 Americans died. 13,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 95%. Of 32,000 soldiers and sailors, fewer than 1,000 survived to become prisoners. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. The civilian population suffered alongside the military. Approximately 22,000 Japanese and Korean civilians were on Saipan. Many died in bombardments or fighting. Hundreds committed suicide during the final days, jumping from cliffs at Marpi Point. Mothers threw their children from cliffs before jumping themselves. American troops desperately tried to stop the suicides, calling out in Japanese, offering food and medical care. Some civilians surrendered. Many did not. The cliffs became known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, names that persist as reminders of the war's fanaticism. For the United States, Saipan's capture marked a turning point. Within months, B-29 bombers began operating from the island. On November 24, 1944, the first raid was launched against Tokyo. 111 bombers struck the Nakajima aircraft engine plant. The strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japanese cities had begun. The political repercussions were equally significant. Saipan's loss shocked the Japanese government. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was forced to resign on July 18. His entire cabinet fell. General Kuniakai Koiso became prime minister, but the war was clearly lost. Saipan had put American bombers within range of the home islands. The combined fleet was shattered. The economy was collapsing. There would be no miracle. For the Marines who fought at Saipan, the tank battle became a defining memory. Corporal McQueen and Charlie 1-3's crew survived without casualties. Their Sherman took several hits but none penetrated. McQueen would fight at Tinian and Iwo Jima, earning a Silver Star. When asked about Saipan decades later, he focused on the Japanese tankers who drove to their deaths with determination. They had to know they couldn't win, he said in 1990. But they came anyway. That's what made them so dangerous. Not their equipment, their willingness to die. Sergeant Hennessy was wounded at Tinian when a satchel charge damaged his tank. He survived, returned to Massachusetts, worked in construction for 40 years. He attended reunions regularly until his death in 2003. In preserved letters, he wrote repeatedly about June 17th, trying to make sense of a battle that lasted under 2 hours but killed hundreds. The technology that decided the battle was not particularly advanced. The Sherman was a good tank but not great. By European standards, it was outmatched by the best German vehicles. But the Sherman did not have to face Tigers in the Pacific. It only had to face Chihas and Hagos, and against those it was completely dominant. The 75mm gun that struggled against German armor went through Japanese armor like tissue paper. The Sherman's reliability was unmatched by any Japanese tank. Its ease of maintenance, mechanical robustness, ability to operate under conditions that would disable more complex vehicles, all contributed to American superiority. But technology alone did not decide the battle. Training mattered. American tank crews practiced gunnery until they could load and fire in their sleep. They drilled on radio procedures until communication became instinctive. Japanese tank crews received minimal training. Japan's industrial base could not produce enough tanks for extensive training. Fuel shortages meant crews often trained in stationary vehicles. The gap showed in every engagement. American tanks hit targets on first shots. Japanese tanks required multiple shots. American tanks communicated instantly. Japanese tanks often had no working radios. American tanks fought as coordinated teams. Japanese tanks attacked as individuals. Doctrine mattered even more. American armor doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare. Tanks never operated alone but in coordination with infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. Japanese doctrine, developed for China operations, did not emphasize combined arms to the same degree. This worked in China. It was disastrous in the Pacific. The aftermath of Saipan's tank battle rippled through both militaries. For Americans, it confirmed Japanese armor was not a serious threat. Future operations could be planned without significant concern about tank counterattacks. At Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, commanders knew their Shermans would dominate any armored engagement. For the Japanese, the lessons were painful. The 9th Tank Regiment's destruction demonstrated that Japanese tanks could not compete offensively. Subsequent commanders chose not to repeat Goto's mistake. Remaining tanks were dug in as static fortifications, their mobility sacrificed to create heavily armored pillboxes. Japan attempted to develop better tanks in response. The Type 3 Chinu, Type 4 Chitu, and Type 5 Chiri were designed and prototyped, but none were produced in significant numbers. Japan's industrial capacity was too limited. The few improved tanks remained in Japan for homeland defense that never came. Production numbers tell the story. Japan produced approximately 6,000 tanks during the entire war. The United States produced nearly 50,000 M4 Shermans alone. Even if Japanese tanks had been qualitatively equal, the numerical disparity would have been overwhelming. American industry replaced losses within weeks. Japanese industry struggled to build replacements at all. By 1945, American tank production was so robust that units could use Shermans for specialized roles. Flamethrower tanks, dozer tanks, recovery vehicles were all converted Shermans. Japan had no such luxury. Every tank served in its designed role because there were no spares. The industrial disparity extended to every aspect of armored warfare. American tanks had reliable radios, high-quality optics, gyrostabilized guns, sophisticated fire control. Japanese tanks often had no radios, used simple periscopes, mounted unbalanced guns. American tanks consumed prodigious fuel, but fuel was always available. Japanese tanks consumed less but often could not get fuel at all as submarines strangled supply lines. The human cost was measured not just in casualties but in psychological impact. For American tankers, the battle provided confidence. They had faced the largest Japanese tank attack and crushed it with minimal losses. This confidence permeated subsequent operations. For Japanese soldiers, their armor's destruction had the opposite effect. They understood American tanks were essentially invulnerable. This bred fatalism shown in increasing suicide tactics. If conventional weapons could not defeat Shermans, perhaps dying with the tank could. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with greater industrial capacity and population. Japan had neither. The legacy of Saipan's tank battle extends beyond immediate results. The engagement demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Superior technology matters but is not decisive alone. Training and doctrine matter as much as hardware. Combined arms integration matters more than individual weapons. Industrial capacity and logistics matter more than tactical brilliance. These lessons were not new in 1944 but were relearned on Saipan's bloody ground. The specific details have faded somewhat from memory. Saipan does not have the same cultural resonance as Bastogne or Iwo Jima. But for the men who fought that night, the battle remained vivid for life. McQueen, interviewed in 1998, described when star shells illuminated advancing tanks. "It was like something from a nightmare," he said. "All those tanks coming out of darkness. And I remember thinking, this is where I die. But then we started shooting and they started burning and I realized, no, this is where they die. And they did. All of them died and we lived, and I still don't know why it was them and not us, except we had better tanks and better training and they had courage, but courage wasn't enough." The mathematical reality of industrial warfare is uncomfortable. We want to believe courage matters more than production capacity. Sometimes it can. More often it cannot. The Japanese tankers who charged on June 17th were brave men. They knew the odds. They attacked anyway. Their courage did not save them because courage alone cannot defeat superior technology and overwhelming firepower. The American tankers were also brave, though their bravery is less obvious because they survived. It takes courage to sit in a steel box while enemy tanks fire at you. It takes courage to advance under fire, to close with the enemy, to fight at ranges where both sides can kill. The Marines demonstrated that courage in every engagement. They also demonstrated professional competence. The ability to perform complex tasks under stress, coordinate with other units, maintain equipment under adverse conditions, adapt to unexpected situations. These skills, less dramatic than individual heroism but equally important, were what ultimately won the battle and the war. The Sherman tanks that fought at Saipan went on to subsequent campaigns. Some were destroyed. Some were damaged and rebuilt. Some survived intact and were eventually scrapped or became monuments. 3 Shermans remain today, submerged in shallow water off Saipan's western coast. They were abandoned after the battle and left to rust in tropical waters. Today they are popular diving sites, their hulls encrusted with coral, interiors home to tropical fish. The wrecks are protected as historic sites, part of the American Memorial Park. Divers from around the world come to swim through these tanks, to see the turrets where young Marines once fought, to touch the 75mm guns that once destroyed enemy armor. The tanks sit in approximately 30 feet of water, clearly visible from the surface on calm days. Their serial numbers and unit markings have long since been obscured by decades of marine growth, but their shapes remain instantly recognizable. Similar preservation protects Japanese tank wrecks. Several Type 97 Chiha tanks remain where they were destroyed in June 1944, their hulls still bearing the unmistakable marks of 75mm armor-piercing projectiles. One sits near the roadside on the northern part of the island, a rusting monument that tourists photograph without always understanding what they are seeing. The hole in its turret, where an American shell penetrated and detonated the ammunition inside, tells its own story of the battle's violence. Another Japanese tank remains partially buried in volcanic soil near what was once Lake Susupe, its gun still pointed toward where American lines stood 80 years ago. These wrecks remind us of the battle, physical evidence of events that might otherwise fade into abstraction. Looking at a rusted tank hull, seeing the hole where a round penetrated, understanding that men died inside that steel box, the human cost becomes more real than any statistics can convey. The museum at American Memorial Park contains artifacts from both sides. American uniforms and weapons, Japanese equipment and personal effects, photographs of young men who fought and died on this volcanic island. The photographs are most affecting. They show ordinary young men in uniforms, smiling at cameras, looking impossibly young. These were the men who operated tanks, who fought the battle, who created the history we study. Most were in their early 20s. Some were teenagers. They came from farms and cities, wealthy and poor families, every region of their countries. They had hopes and dreams cut short on a tropical island most had never heard of before war. The question that haunts anyone studying Saipan is whether the battle needed to happen at all. By June 1944, Japan had already lost. The combined fleet was broken. Industry was collapsing. Submarines were strangling supply lines. The strategic situation was hopeless. Continuing to fight could only increase casualties without changing the outcome. Yet both sides continued because neither could find a way to stop. The Japanese government could not admit defeat. The military code made surrender unthinkable. American political opinion demanded unconditional surrender. There was no mechanism for negotiated peace, no diplomatic channel, no face-saving formula. So fighting continued. Saipan was captured at enormous cost. Then Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each more brutal than the last. Firebombing killed hundreds of thousands. Atomic bombings killed hundreds of thousands more. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria crushed Japanese forces in China. Only then did Japan surrender. The tank battle at Saipan was one small piece of this larger tragedy. 44 Japanese tanks attacked. 31 were destroyed. Hundreds of men died in a battle lasting under 2 hours that accomplished nothing except adding to casualty lists. The men who died believed they were fighting for their country, for their emperor, for their honor. They were brave men doing their duty as they understood it. Their bravery did not change the outcome. It only changed the number of bodies that had to be buried. Sergeant Hennessy wrote about this in 1946. "We killed a lot of Japanese at Saipan," he wrote. "I don't feel proud of it and I don't feel guilty about it. It was war and they were trying to kill us and we killed them instead. But sometimes I think about the men in those tanks. They had to know they couldn't win. Their tanks were worse than ours. Their guns couldn't penetrate our armor. They had to know they were going to die. And they attacked anyway. That kind of courage, I don't know what to call it. Bravery, fanaticism, duty, all of those things maybe. I respect it even though I don't understand it. And I wish it hadn't been necessary to kill them all." This sentiment characterized many American veterans' attitudes. They recognized enemy courage while being horrified by its waste in futile attacks. They understood they had fought brave men. They wished those brave men had chosen surrender over death. They knew cultural and political circumstances made surrender impossible. They lived with that knowledge and the memories of killing men who would not surrender for the rest of their lives. The psychological cost of combat affected many Pacific War veterans. The nature of fighting, close-range brutality, enemy refusal to surrender, high casualties, all created trauma veterans carried for decades. Some adjusted well to civilian life. Others struggled with nightmares, depression, survivor's guilt. Modern understanding gives us language to describe what these men experienced. In 1945, that language did not exist. Veterans were expected to readjust quickly and quietly. Those who struggled were dismissed as weak. Psychological wounds were not acknowledged as real injuries. Many veterans found solace in connecting with others who shared experiences. Tank battalion reunions became annual events where men could discuss things civilians could not understand. They reminisced about training, equipment problems, mundane military life details. They rarely discussed combat in detail. Memories were too painful, too complicated to share with anyone who had not been there. But they could sit together in silence and understand each other's silence. That understanding was valuable even when words failed. On Saipan today, the battlefields are quiet. Vegetation has covered combat scars. The island is home to approximately 50,000 people, American citizens living in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Tourists visit beaches, diving sites, historical memorials. Most know little about the tank battle that occurred 80 years ago. This forgetting is natural. The world moves on. New conflicts replace old ones in public consciousness. The Second World War recedes into history, its participants dying, its battles becoming abstractions studied in schools rather than living memories. Soon there will be no one left who fought at Saipan. the direct connection will be broken. We will have only the historical record, artifacts, photographs, carefully preserved battlefields. And the stories. Stories like McQueen's account of that night when Japanese tanks came from darkness and American Shermans destroyed them. Stories like Hennessy's letters trying to explain the inexplicable. Stories like Goto's decision to lead tanks in an attack he knew was hopeless. These stories matter because they are all we have. The events themselves are gone, existing only as patterns in aging brains and marks on paper and film. The stories are how we remember, how we try to understand, how we honor the men who fought and died. This particular story, the tale of 44 Japanese tanks and the Sherman crews who destroyed them, is a small piece of much larger history. But it contains truths about courage and technology, about industrial warfare and human endurance, about combat costs and war's waste. It deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war, not to celebrate killing, but to honor the men who fought, to understand forces that shaped their actions, to learn from their sacrifices. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.